I think it's just a very interesting text within the New Testament. It's unusual. I mean, we don't have anything about the death and resurrection of Jesus, for example, in James, whereas that is pretty important in the letters of Paul, for example. It's narrated in the Gospels. We don't have anything about Last Supper or Eucharistic meal or baptism. So it's pretty different from, I mean, all of the texts are different, but James, I think, stands out in part for what it lacks. And yet there's this interesting connection between James and Jesus traditions. So there's been a lot of work done, and even interpreters from the time of the early church noticed this. When you read James, you notice it kind of sounds like the Sermon on the Mount sometimes.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Alicia Batten, and I gotta say, I'm always pumped, like to the point that when I finish these interviews, I generally have to go walk my dogs to kind of come down because there's a lot of energy for me around having these conversations. So I always enjoy myself having these conversations. That said, there are guests whose publications lend themselves more to the expansive nature of where I want the podcast to go. There's always a certain amount of expertise, what I like to call around the text. But in this case, this is a very good example. The things that we discuss, clothing, status, they're common to every culture. Or rather, they exist in every culture, but they exist differently enough in every culture that it's worth noting, that it's worth pointing out when we need to learn about the details to have a better understanding. And so the idea that the text is just the text, reading a biblical passage, that it's either just what you get from it as a reader in your moment, or there's a right answer. I think it's very helpful to be reminded there's a whole education around just looking at the historical aspects, the cultural aspects of a biblical text. I'll leave it there. I think the conversation does a pretty good job of following those different tracks. So if you have any feedback for me, please reach out at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Please spread the word about the podcast, subscribe where you're listening, and if you really want to go one step beyond, $5 a month as a Patreon supporter will get you episodes early and access to video episodes, which is not something that I do for free. Okay, that's it. Enjoy my conversation with Alicia Batten. Alicia Batten, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a professor of New Testament, early Christianity, Christian origins. I teach here in Canada in the province of Ontario. So I'm at Conrad Grebel University College, which is affiliated with the University of Waterloo in Waterloo. Yeah, so I've been teaching for quite a while now. Did teach in the States for 10 years, but I am originally from Ontario.
Where down here did you teach?
I taught in Minnesota, in St. Paul, Minnesota for 2 years at the University of St. Thomas. And then I taught in Washington State, out on the West Coast, in Tacoma, Washington at Pacific Lutheran University. Taught there 8 years. Yeah.
I was kind of half expecting you to say Georgia, and then I wanted to hear what that transition would be like. Okay, well, so jumping into your article, Courtroom Theatrics in the Letter of James. So I know this isn't the first question I sent you, but I am kind of curious sometimes. So why James? How did you end up doing this work in James?
Yeah, well, I've been working on James for a long time. I wrote my dissertation on the letter of James. I focused on the theme of friendship in James, because you probably know in James we have this image of Abraham as a friend of God, and James has this line about friendship with the world is enmity with God. So I was interested in understanding how, especially the Greco-Roman understanding of friendship, uh, played a role within the text. And I really like James, even after all these years. I still like studying James and writing about James. I think it's just a very interesting text within the New Testament. It's unusual. I mean, we don't have anything about the death and resurrection of Jesus, for example, in James, whereas that is pretty important in the letters of Paul, for example. It's narrated in the Gospels. We don't have anything about Last Supper or Eucharistic meal or baptism. So it's pretty different from, I mean, all of the texts are different, but James, I think, stands out in part for what it lacks. And yet there's this interesting connection between James and Jesus traditions. So there's been a lot of work done, and even interpreters from the time of the early church noticed this. When you read James, you notice it kind of sounds like the Sermon on the Mount sometimes, but it doesn't cite Jesus, it doesn't say, Jesus said this, but it will have passages like, has not God, this is in James chapter 2, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom? So it's interesting that James connects the poor with the kingdom, as in the Beatitude, blessed are the poor. So there's lots of connections between James and Jesus tradition, which is really interesting, and trying to understand why we have these resonances between James and Jesus tradition, and yet so little reflection on Jesus is an interesting question. I mean, we have two references to Jesus at the very beginning, and then at the beginning of chapter 2, and even in the second one, some think might be a later interpolation just because of the grammar of the Greek there. But yeah, so here we have, whoever wrote this and whoever read this, what kind of Christ group was this? I think that's a really interesting question to ask, because it seems to be quite different from especially the Pauline churches. So yeah, that's just a few of the reasons why James continues to be really fascinating to me.
It does automatically in my book make it more interesting when I come across something that's not Paul,
Yeah.
or I guess, or the Gospels. I'd imagine that's probably where most of the effort in scholarly pursuits of New Testament studies are, Paul or the Gospels. So
Mm-hmm.
when I get to see like some Hebrews, I have yet to come across anything that centers like Jude or something, but James for sure. And I mean, you mentioned this, just kind of explaining how you, or what, explaining your work in the letter of James. Rich people don't come out looking very good
No.
in the book of James, which is interesting because I think oftentimes people kind of view biblical text as scaffolding for wealth or status
Mm-hmm.
quo.
Mm-hmm.
But so specifically, you're dealing with James 2:1-7.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the courtroom theatrics there. And I know you start out the article talking about the interpretation applied in churches where wealthier families would rent, they would rent, I guess, more prominent pews. I don't know that I ever came across this in like firsthand. And so that kind of threw a wrench in how people understood it. Can you give us a little history on the interpretation of this passage?
Yeah, I mean, like all biblical texts, the history of interpretation is quite varied, right? Because interpreters are always shaped by the context in which they live. So it's not like there was just one way of reading this text in James. So many people have talked about the economic concerns in the text, even going back to, I'm thinking of there was an 8th century interpreter called the Venerable Bede, um, and he thinks that James is rebuking members of the audience who were not caring for the poor So he was really, focused on the economic dimensions. But then you have other readers, like there was a German um, nun named Hildegard of Bingen. She was less willing to critique the rich. She said that's just the way things are. There are rich people, there are poor people. That's the most important thing is that both should have access to the same spiritual kinds of resources. Um, and then, of course, once, when the Christian church early on, once it became a more powerful kind of institution, it relied often on wealthy people to support the church. So leaders might be reluctant to critique them, and then that could affect the way they interpret some of these texts. Um, so even John Calvin, the reformer, he doesn't think that the passage attacks the idea of showing respect to wealthy people, but he focuses on how bad it is to look down on the poor. So instead of critiquing the rich, he focuses on, well, you have to treat the poor people well. So he is willing to criticize wealth, not so much because people are wealthy, but because they attribute their good standing. They think they're great, essentially, because of their own efforts rather than God. Um, so it really, I think the interpretation has been quite broad. Um, it's even been read in light of racial discrimination at certain points. And, some interpreters are going to focus much more on theological questions, but there is a consistent stream, I think, of people noting the economic dimension of the text as well. But as I say in the article, the placing it within the context of a courtroom, that has quite a rich history going back to, the 17th century. So people did make those kinds of comparisons. What I'm saying is not new, in other words.
And clothing really drives that interpretation for you, which is a bit of a
Yeah.
twist for a lot of us because it's not how we think of a courtroom setting.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really interested in dress and dress history and the role of dress within the New Testament. And part of that is because for ancient people, so much so much was at stake in how you appeared to other people, including how you dressed. Even like it's fascinating to read these ancient writers who are you know very concerned about how your hair was done, both for men and women. This was not an exclusively sort of female domain. What shade of red are your shoes? Like these, it's a very visual kind of culture, and things like honor and shame really relied on how you appeared in public. So people had to be very careful about how they dressed. They had to dress according to their rank and status, but dress could also be used to manipulate their perception in the public domain. So it's really, really important. And in fact, the reason why I got into this is because I wondered, why does it say that the rich man has these shining clothes with a ring, and then the other guy is in dirty dress? Like, why does James bother to include those kinds of details? Because details always matter within biblical text. They're not just randomly, describing things. Um, so yeah, I think clothing is really important to pay attention to within the ancient world, and classical scholars are spending a lot of energy on that. I think it's also just intrinsically interesting. Um, but then, yeah, it was through just noticing those details in James that I then wondered, well, can this give us clues as to what kind of scenario the author's actually thinking about here?
Is it that I guess the congregation in treating the wealthy in this way, this favorable way, and therefore disfavoring the poor,
Mhm.
are they creating enmity? Like so you're seeing these distinctions that seem to um, bring about or invoke the courtroom setting. Is that like, hey, you guys are creating conflict here?
James makes the argument, right, that basically by treating the poor man or the man dressed in dirty clothes with dishonor, dishonoring them by ordering them to sit at their feet, or sit in the corner or whatever, whereas you're giving a nice seat, nice bench to the wealthy man. That's making distinctions. That's showing partiality, and you're not supposed to do that. Like that violates the Torah. That violates Leviticus. So he is making a larger point, but he's using this scene of the courtroom to do it, essentially. And showing partiality in a courtroom, it happened all the time. Of course there was lots of corruption, but it had grave consequences for people, because you lose your case, who knows what your punishment could be. It could be exile, it could be death, it could be a huge fine. So it had very serious consequences for people, and I think James is using this kind of imagery. Like, I think this is a scenario they would have been familiar with. He's using this, I think, to make this larger point about how you shouldn't be showing partiality to the wealthy.
And so, where did partiality play in ancient Roman courts?
Yeah, all over the place. um, I mean, there's a book by Leanne Bablitz, I think her last name is, called Actors and Audiences in the Roman, I think in the Roman Courtroom, I think is the title. And I mean, that makes it clear that these were performances. Like, courtroom trials were performances. And so there could be all kinds of partiality because someone gave a better performance than another person. And so there was bribery. In fact, at certain points historically, there was a law forbidding judges from taking bribes. That's what it was so bad. They had to create a law to do that. Apparently, a couple of emperors, I think it was Tiberius and also maybe Domitian, even lectured judges about not taking bribes, because that clearly was not upholding ideas of justice. So there could be all kinds of partiality being displayed in these courts, given just the nature of ancient society and the possibility for bribes and corruption, um, such that James here feels he's got to fight against that, because that's hurting well, it's not upholding Torah for one. Yeah.
I think that's an important distinction to bring up, the Torah piece, because a lot of times I know I was taught in churches, oh, the law, that doesn't matter, but you're saying here, like, no, this is still a thing. But is there I guess, like a kingdom of God aspect of it too, that what the churches were expected to be?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, James does mention kingdom, right? He says the poor are rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, but we don't have an elaborate. James doesn't talk about the kingdom of God a lot. Um, but I think James is presuming that these people uphold Torah, or they should be upholding Torah. So these are primarily Jews, Jewish Christians, so people for whom there's no question that you follow Torah. He just assumes it. Um, and there is, yeah, this idea of kingdom, but I don't think it plays a central role in James the way it does, for example, in the teachings of Jesus. Yeah, so I think it's different.
So it is kind of siloed into a question of justice then, as it applies to courtrooms, but not necessarily in the way that we think of that.
Um, yeah, I mean, certainly the Romans thought that justice should govern the way the courts run, right? And that's why they had laws against bribery. They emphasized justice, even though it could end up being brutal for a lot of people. Um, and yeah, I think James does want to uphold justice, especially as embodied by Torah, right? Especially as embodied by um, the notion of what God wants. So James is very theocentric. God figures pretty centrally in this letter. Um, but you don't have the kingdom of God front and center the way that you do, I think, in the teachings of Jesus. Mm-hmm.
And so, particularly with regard to the word, and please correct me if I get the pronunciation wrong, synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there were multiple uses of this in antiquity, and we would know that being rendered to us as something like synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
But you covered different approaches, Roman, Christian, and Jewish. What are the differences in how that word was used?
Well, I mean, it depends where the synagogue was and at what time historically. But if James is written late first, early second century, increasingly historians think that the synagogue was best compared to the ancient association, which were all over the place in the ancient world. So these could be, they're also called collegia in Latin. And so these were um, sort of like service clubs in some ways. They provided sort of like a community center for people. Sometimes they were based on an occupation, and we have lots of inscriptional evidence for them from Italy, from Greece, from Asia Minor, from all over the place. Um, and sometimes they're called a synagogue. And so there's no reason why we have to think of synagogues at this point, at least historically, as any different from other kinds of associations, except for the fact that um, they were especially for Judeans or Jews, but there's also evidence not exclusively so. So you could have Gentiles participating. There could be mixed ethnicities participating in these synagogues. And again, it's a place that you could have um, courts, obviously. So you could have legal disputes being resolved in these associations. That would be one place that people could go to do that. Um, Sometimes places for reading, for study, uh, places sometimes where travelers might be able to stay. So there's evidence archaeologically that rooms were there for people so that people could just bunk there for the night if they were traveling. Um, but general sociability, like humans need to interact and have clubs and have social time. So if we can think of them, I think more broadly as a kind of civic center or social center, um, that Jews would participate in. And it shows that, at least at this point, that so many Jews throughout the Roman Empire were so well integrated into the broader social life of whatever city it was that their synagogue existed in. But I think it is interesting to think about how they weren't necessarily exclusively Jewish. There were what they called the God-fearers or theosebes, so Gentiles who were really interested in Judaism, who would also participate in these synagogues.
But they sound like not really one thing that we have today, or at least not
Right.
in the United States. It's several things
Mm-hmm.
that we might have, but then also I'm thinking of a recent conversation I had with Jason Borges on how travel worked, and so he's talking about Phoebe may have hosted people in Rome, and Paul is commending her to people in Rome as someone they may have stayed with, and so it's like it attaches you to a possible larger social network in a way
Right.
that we don't really understand. We have commercial interactions for that, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, although we have things like Kiwanis clubs, things like that. They're maybe not as popular today as they once were, but I think there are forms of clubs, service organizations that often raise a lot of money for charities, or help out in, they'll make sandwiches for some kind of event or whatever it is. So those, I'm not saying it's identical, but these kind of clubs or organizations that provide a sense of belonging, I think, for people. I mean, there's no reason why people in the ancient world didn't need that, um, and sociability that just work themselves out differently, maybe today, but were nevertheless a need, I think, for ancient people as well.
But you did mention solving and legal disputes, and that
Mm-hmm.
is, I think the thing that stands out to me more though is, as much as people like to bag on bureaucracy has really it's made us more mobile,
Mm-hmm.
and in a lot of ways less personally connected, but in a lot of other ways, much more commercially connected. But for a synagogue, for your local synagogue, to have any part in legal disputes, the closest thing I can think of to that would be arbitration. But to my knowledge, churches and synagogues they don't tend to do that much. And you're saying
No,
that's a component here?
that's right. We have evidence that, like Josephus talks about how legal proceedings could take place in synagogues. So that wouldn't be so strange. So it's not an exclusively like religious place. And in fact, many scholars think that the term religion isn't really appropriate for thinking about this time period because religion often implies something separate from other aspects of our lives. Like we go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque or wherever. But for the ancient people, sort of it was everywhere. It was in the household, temples, public places. I mean, you can't separate it out and put it in a separate compartment from other aspects of life. So it seems that synagogues and these other collegia were fairly places, multi-purpose places, let's put it that way, where different kinds of activities could take place. And people needed not everybody was going to go to court to try to solve some kind of conflict. They needed other places where they could have a mediator or, if they possibly, an arbitrator, because, well, for one, legal protections were only for citizens, and also courts could be expensive. More. So if you didn't have a lot of money, but you had some kind of dispute, it could be a family dispute, it could be a property dispute, some kind of financial dispute. You couldn't necessarily afford to go to court. You might not want to go to court because you don't want it to be so public, even though it was hard to be private in the ancient world. So going to the local association would be a possibility, I would think, for some people. And we see examples in the New Testament where, that I mentioned, that they're even counseled to settle their dispute. Don't go to court. And probably as well, it was because the courts were known to be pretty corrupt.
I'm trying to remember what the case was, but in the article you mention basically a poorer, less powerful family believes a wealthier person has murdered someone in their family,
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember if they're invoking poverty or mourning through their dress. Is that what it was?
Yes, that's right. So they dressed in dirty clothes, even though they might not have been poor. But this is part of the theatrics that I was trying to get at, and the fact that it was a performance. And so they follow around the person that they're complaining about, and they're wearing dirty clothes because dirt connected to the feeling of abjection and mourning. And so people would know what that meant. So this is part of their argument, if you will, and their complaint against this person who had committed the murder, or they believed had committed the murder. Yeah. So it would be an expectation in the eyes of ancient people. This is what they would kind of regularly see if they went to a court and, saw often the defendant would be dressed poorly, even if they weren't poor themselves, but just because they were taking on that role, they would reflect that through the way in which they dressed.
And that comes back around in James 5, which you also. So you talk about James 2 and you talk about more than that, but James 2 and James 5.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a comment to the wealthy on, like, here's what your clothes actually look like.
Yeah, I mean, they're in James 5, and he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming upon you." And then he refers to their clothes actually rotting. So it's this greed, right? They've stored up these treasures, and so it's an interesting connection to chapter 2, both because of the rich poor dynamic, but also because of these references, like he mentions gold and silver have rusted, and so one wonders, does he have in mind the gold ringed man from chapter 2? He talks about their clothes rotting or getting eaten by insects. Um, so again, you make a connection to the shining, brilliant clothes of chapter 2. Um, but yeah, it's their greed. They're taking more than they needed. And James, I think, is deliberately um, invoking these images of wealth in the form of clothing and jewelry that would represent, you know, obviously a very negative portrayal of rich people.
You mentioned jewelry, and I think, and I know I put it in one of the questions. There's something in there about gold and silver as opposed to iron or some other
Right.
substance.
Yeah.
What 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 would an iron ring represent?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Um, Iron rings were popular, and apparently they could represent rank for ancient Roman men. So you had rank and then you had status, and rank were like juridical distinctions between people, like an equestrian or a senator, whereas status was your sort of the perception of you within the public and your financial wealth. So you could be wealthy but not of a very high rank. But apparently, the iron ring was associated with men who had the office of praetor, which is a pretty high civic official. And apparently, Roman senators also wore iron rings for a time, at least as a symbol of valor, and as well. Military successes or military exploits sometimes earn people the right to wear a gold ring in contrast to an iron ring. But so yeah, these rings could indicate different things at different times, but sometimes people would um, usurp, like they'd wear a ring that they didn't really have the right to wear because they wanted to increase their status in in public opinion. So yeah, it is interesting to think about just how much attention they paid even to the metal that was used for the particular ring, and then that could represent different things, but especially rank.
I
um,
think today we would call that stolen valor,
yeah.
right? And you get dragged on the internet for wearing the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. Was the distinction between a criminal and civil legal system, did that exist in ancient Roman society?
um That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't think it clearly exists. There was certainly awareness that there was lots of criminality within the legal system and bribery, corruption, like we talked about. Um, and it came down to who could you trust, right? And what kinds of reputation I imagine different people would have within the system. Um, but I'm not aware that they made a clear distinction between criminal and legal.
That's fair.
Yeah.
To what extent would you feel confident kind of giving us a description of what would the seating arrangement look like in an ancient synagogue that a rich person would get a prominent seat? Because I can't get pews out of my head,
Right.
but that doesn't seem right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I can't give you any precision on that. As far as I'm aware, I mean, and here is where the archaeology is really important, but there would be benches, um, you know, benches like around the outer wall, and then there could be more benches, closer to the middle, um, and then often a table or something like that. Um, but where the best seat was, that may depend on the individual building. um, so it could be like, I know that certainly this is not in the synagogue setting, but in the theater and so forth, there were distinctions made on where were the best seats in the theater, and certainly those who had higher rank, higher status could sit closer to the front. So there were clearly better seats, just like there are at hockey games and football games and stuff like that today. So so there would be distinctions, but can't give you any precision on that.
That's fair. That's
Hmm.
why I couched it with
Yeah.
how comfortable would you be?
Yeah.
Because I've only been in a couple of synagogues, and they didn't actually look that different from what I had experienced in churches.
Hmm.
And I just wondered if, is it just like two columns and a bunch of rows of people with like a center aisle? But you're saying it could be any number of. I guess that would depend on local architectural.
Yeah. And how big it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire because that's not really the point. But I'm just trying to get a mental picture because for us, it really would only be, oh well, the more prominent seat in a church would be the one closer up to the front. But
Hmm.
I wondered if that would be the case. But then there's also, if they're meeting in homes, that could be the furniture that the homeowner has, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um,
The most comfortable seat.
what would that be back then?
Probably its size, the cushions, different sorts of things. Yeah.
Because chairs weren't that.
Yeah. It'd be more like a couch or a bench. Yeah.
Beanbag chair, maybe?
Yeah.
No, no? Okay.
No.
I mean, I guess a big enough cushion is just a beanbag chair.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. And again, I know that's not what your article's about. I'm just really curious. I'm trying to get a mental picture. So so the dirty clothes could be a sign of mourning. But they could also be used for the theatrics to benefit someone who's claiming I'm a victim of this person.
That's right. It would gain the sympathy of the jurors,
But
potentially.
it seems like you're losing sympathy with James 5 in saying like your clothes are rotting
Hmm.
if we're sticking to the courtroom theatrics. So could it also play against? Is that why sometimes maybe poorer people, lower class people might not sue because the optics were bad for them?
Um, I think in James 5, there's a different thing going on here. I mean, it's critiquing the rich for their greed, and it's saying what happens to all this material wealth you have that's you're just storing up. You're not wearing it, you're storing up. It's just rotting. It's of no use to anybody. I think that's a different thing from what's going on in James 2. Yeah.
It's just that the connection is the clothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's fair.
Mhm.
And so he's saying who you really are, what your clothes really look like, is not what you think they look like because of your. And if memory serves, I don't have it right in front of me. I'd have to minimize something, but it sounds like wage theft. It sounds like abuse of other people.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting in James 5, that's what then it goes on to talk about how they've exploited the worker, right? In chapter 5. Um, because it says right after it mentions the gold and silver rusting, it says their rust will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. And I wondered, are they referring to the ring there? If your ring gets too tight and it cuts into your fingers. um, and then it says, you've laid up treasure for the last days. And then it says, behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of house. You've lived in the earth in luxury and in pleasure, and you've fattened your hearts a day of slaughter. So, yeah, it's connecting it clearly to um, their poor treatment of, in this case, the laborers, farm worker, agricultural workers. Yeah.
I like. So I have the NRSV updated edition, and in verse 4 where yours says behold, mine says
Oh,
listen with an exclamation
okay.
mark. Listen.
Yeah.
And yeah, you have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you, which I don't know if that's bringing it back around to like a courtroom motif, but over in 2 it's definitely saying you're treating rich people better than you're treating poor people.
Yeah.
And then later on, 3 chapters later, there's condemnation for the wealthy people who have abused, and so you don't want to be party to to what's about to come, right? Like this is the setup for like be careful who your friends are,
That's
right?
right. They will be judged. They're going to be judged. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So we're approaching an hour, and I like to make sure that we cover things that I leave out, which in
Okay.
most cases is many things. Is there anything in the article that you were really hoping I would ask about that has not come up?
Um, well, one thing you did ask me is just how were people generally honored in the ancient world, and I think that's worth just stressing to your listeners just how important honor was in ancient Mediterranean cultures, like in this day to day living, this um, day to day interactions with people on the street. So much was riding on how you were perceived in public. So there were a great many ways in which you could honor a person, and then there were a great many ways in which a person could feel slighted and suffer damage to their reputation. So I think when we read biblical texts, it behooves us to pay attention to those kinds of dynamics because um, we don't share the culture of these ancient writers, obviously, and they don't spell out for us what an ancient reader or an ancient hearer would automatically pick up on. We have to research and try to understand what was going on and what people valued. But I think just reading these texts with eyes that are a little bit more culturally sensitive to some of the values that would have been very important to these people can then bring out dimensions of these texts that we don't necessarily appreciate just reading them at face value. So I'm a big advocate for what they call social scientific criticism or engaging cultural anthropology and things like that when we read these texts because I think they can, it's not foolproof or anything like that, but they can pull out dimensions of the dynamics here that are not at all obvious just from reading the text.
And giving a wealthy, higher status, higher class person a good seat may well have you just like you're just trying to be cooperate with the world around you, right?
Yeah, right.
And so not doing that might cause you some trouble.
That's right. Yeah. But James, makes a pretty strong argument that this is basically violating Torah. And if you're violating this, you're violating all of Torah. That's what he says. So he's pretty tough on this point. But I think, yeah, it probably would have been a challenge for people in the day to day life of the Roman world.
Yeah, I mean
Hmm.
it would take a fair amount of integrity to say, well, I mean, no, these are the rules that guide us. This is how
Hmm.
we understand who we are. This is who we want to be, and so we're not going to violate that just so that we don't get in trouble with people who are joining us to be a part of this community, and so
Right.
should be adopting those same rules, right?
Hmm. That's right. That's right.
Which goes even further into the people who are being condemned in James chapter 5. Like, I mean, hey, I guess you're welcome. You're welcome here to join us, but you should not think that you get to be treated special, like you're special,
hmm
and you should not think that you get to keep abusing people.
hmm
He's kind of putting his foot down, right?
That's right, for sure. Yeah, it's pretty tough. Some people have said James kind of barks at his audience. Yeah, he's not afraid to tell them what to do. That's for
You
sure.
you would think Martin Luther would have liked him more with that kind of attitude.
Apparently, he liked him at the beginning, but then as things went on, he came to not like him.
I see that disliking people seems to be the gradient that he followed. Uh, so there's a lot of citations in this, so stretch your legs on this question. But where would you direct people, like books, blogs,
Oh
YouTube
yeah.
channels, to learn more about ancient dress, ancient courtrooms, or the Letter of
Hmm.
James?
Yeah. Well, for dress, I co-edited a book. I'm self-promoting, but I co-edited a book with a classical scholar named Kelly Olson, and she's got two other books. One on Roman women's dress in the Roman woman, I think it's called, and the other one is on male dress in the Roman Empire. She's great. Her books are just full of information, interesting information about dress in the ancient world. So I would highly recommend her work. When it comes to Roman courts, there's a scholar named Leanne Bablitz. I think I cite her a bunch of times in the article. She has a book, I mentioned it earlier, actors and audience in the Roman courtroom. So it's very, very helpful. So you could take a look at that. Also, there's I think an Oxford companion to Roman social life or something like that. I think she has a couple of essays in there, as well as other people. So if they're interested in Roman courts, on James, depends what you're interested in. More and more, I think, is being produced on James. I think Dale Allison's commentary in the New International Critical, I think that's right, series is one of the best in English. It's very big, very detailed, but really great. And he's taking into account all this interpretation of James in the past. And if people are interested in how James has been read through the centuries, there's a series called the Bible Through the Ages, or I can't remember exactly what the series is called, but there's a commentary by David Gowler, and it's on James and looks at how James has been read through the centuries. James Through the Centuries, I think it's called. So that's a really good commentary too, if people are interested in looking especially at how James has been read, over time. Another resource that I usually recommend and that I use in teaching is produced by the Society of Biblical Literature. It's called the Bible Odyssey website, and you can search it. So if you're interested in, it doesn't have everything, and it's growing all of the time. People are writing more and more articles, but if you're interested in short articles, bibliography, videos, it's a great starting point, and you can just put in a search term and find out all kinds of interesting information, obviously about the Bible, but also about a lot of topics related to the Bible, about the ancient world in general. So I would recommend it. It's just BibleOdyssey.org.
You are not the first, and this I think this is just in keeping with the idea of Canadians being polite and helpful. The first person to recommend that on this podcast was William Morrow. So,
oh, okay, that's funny.
so just keep that up, because that is. I want to say one or two other people may have recommended it too, but I remember him bringing that up, and I've looked at it, and it is a really good place to go to find stuff. That's a really smart move by Society of Biblical Literature. And so the first, two or three people you named were classicists, right?
Yeah, Kelly Olson is a classicist, and Leanne Bablitz, she's also a classicist. Kelly is actually, she's Canadian. She's at Western University, not far from here in London, Ontario. And Leanne Bablitz, I'm not sure of her nationality, but I think she teaches at the University of British Columbia in BC.
Are there any popular level classics type things that can help people understand, like a Greco-Roman, that you would throw out there?
Yeah, I'm less aware of that. I'm sure there are. You might know. Do you know the History Valley podcast?
I've not heard of that. No.
Okay, it's Jacob Berman, and he interviews biblical scholars, but also historians and so forth. So that's a podcast people could look at that engages a variety of topics related to the ancient world. But I can't think of a popular level classical studies one, but I'm sure they exist.
I'm thinking like I know Mary Beard, her book SPQR. I think she may have written something new recently. All of my reading is siloed into this podcast, so and that's fair. I know I'll throw out there. I really liked Rubicon by Tom Holland.
Okay.
I haven't read any of his I know he wrote one about the Caesars, and I know he wrote Dominion about like the history of Christianity, but as far as understanding the ancient world, actually one of the motivators for this podcast was he would talk about the way that Caesar was referred to as dressing effeminately and acting effeminately because he was very publicly and enthusiastically in love with his wife. And I was just like, that is such a specific cultural take that would not carry over into our time, that you would have to be briefed on that, kind of like what you're saying.
Yeah.
There, fish can't tell you anything about water.
Yeah, and I mean, there's all kind of concerns about like the length of your toga, obviously how it was draped, but how long was it? They would notice if it wasn't the right length, and so I wouldn't think of that unless I, was guided to some of this information. So yeah, it's very much a culture in which the gaze really mattered. I mean, I'm not saying that isn't true now, but um
But we don't have to notice it as much
right.
because we're used to it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
We just know that because again, fish can't tell you anything about water.
Yeah.
So like, actually, this one last thing about ancient clothing. I came across a video kind of detailing how ancient cities were, one, cleaner, and two, more colorful than we have in our minds. Was clothing more colorful than we think of it as in the ancient world?
Well, I think so. If we think about how, we have all these statues of people dressed in togas or stola, or, the pallium, or the oh, I'm forgetting the heton, the himation, all these different types of dress that people would wear in the Greco-Roman world. But these statues are white, right? Mostly, but they would have been originally in color. So I think there was way more color than we imagine, and different colors represented different things, just like the different materials that you could make a ring out of. What colors people wore would indicate different things, and like the length of the stripe on your toga really mattered, or the width rather. There's an inscription from Greece which says, the stripe um, on your tunic can only be 1 finger width wide. They're very specific about how wide that stripe could be. But yeah, I think there was way more color than we really imagine there to have been, because so much of the statuary that we have now has been bleached white, whereas it would have been very originally much more colorful. Yeah.
But for clothing, it's less likely to make its way down to us
Right. And like the
in color.
textile remain, we just don't have the textile remains because it's hard for that kind of material to survive over time. So we have sculpture, we have texts and things like that, but we don't have a lot when it comes to fabric. Yeah.
So, last question, my favorite question: what do you read for fun?
Oh. Well, yeah, all kinds of things. I read a lot of poetry. I read a lot of memoir, because I often teach a course on memoirs. I'm reading a memoir right now by Avi Schleim, who is a Iraqi Jew. Um, Really interesting guy. Yeah, so I'm all over the place really when it comes to reading for fun. Try to read some fiction. So I'm reading some short stories right now by Alistair MacLeod. Yeah.
Who's it? Well, so what? Who's a go-to for poetry, and who's a go-to for fiction?
Um, I poetry, it's various. I like Mary Oliver. She's very well known. I know a lot of people like her. I like some of the classical sort of poets like W.H. Auden, Keats. I love some of that British poetry. I like Rumi, who is a Sufi poet. Um, I like John Wright. I think he was American. I can't remember. Yeah, so again, all over the place. Um, yeah, and then fiction. Well, just mentioned Alistair MacLeod. There's a Canadian author named David Adams Richard who writes big fat novels. They're pretty good, pretty engaging, pretty powerful. I like some of our classical Canadian. Here, I'm a true patriot here, like Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Atwood, um, Alice Munro. Yeah. So not just one person, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
here, fly that Canadian flag. Give me a couple more Canadian names.
Yeah.
Well,
Canadian
I just realized that I have not read enough Canadians.
Oh, okay. Well, W.O. Mitchell, he was a good Canadian author. Farley Mowat, he wrote a lot about stories about nature, the natural world, adventures. Who else can I think of? Michael Ondaatje, he's a pretty interesting writer. Writes. He actually wrote. Remember the movie The English Patient?
Yes, I knew that name.
Yeah, he wrote the novel that it was based on. Yeah.
Look, this is me sharing love for my friends, Jonathan and Martha Arendt. She's a native-born Canadian. He was born in Louisiana, but they now live with their kids in Canada. And he was one of my teachers in high school. And having, he had this wife from Canada, and he was always telling us about Canadian authors. and so it's like 20 plus years ago now that. And I was like, wait, they've been writing books up there?
Yeah.
It's not just hockey and syrup?
Yeah, I think in some universities throughout the world, there are like Canadian studies programs where they read a lot of Canadian literature. So yeah, we have a pretty big library of Canadian writers. Yeah.
Well, whatever bad blood there is between the U.S. and Canada, it does not exist on this podcast.
No. Yeah.
Alicia Batten, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Great. Well, my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening. Not much to add here. Again, if you want to hit me up, it means what it means at gmail.com. Like and subscribe. Leave me reviews. Leave me comments on YouTube or wherever you're listening. Let me know what you think of the podcast. Or if you want to become a supporter on Patreon, $5 a month gets you episodes 10 days early and the additional access of video episodes thrown in there as well. So next week's guest is Alicia Kaufman, and we'll be discussing her book, Turning Points in American Church History. Here is a quick preview of that. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Take care.
The 1960s was where, like, it's all happening, and I could not get it into shape. That was the chapter that changed the most from my original plan to when I got to writing it. I wrote the chapters in order. So it was like the first 7 that I had drafted at Dubuque. It was the back half that I worked on after the hiatus and at Baylor. That was not going to be about the Birmingham church bombing, the 60s chapter. It was going to be more civil rights in a broader definition. It was hopefully going to bring in the Hart-Celler Act, the immigration reform of 1965, and even Vatican II. Just a general opening and openness and more people and ideas being part of the public sphere. It was going to have a much more hopeful tone. When I got to writing that one, that was the summer of George Floyd's murder. And the way the nation was talking about the role of violence, recurrent constant threat of violence when you're talking about race and religion in the United States. I was marching downtown Waco. My daughter was on Waco Youth Council trying to push for finally getting a memorial to the lynching of Jesse Washington in 1916. I felt that 1960s chapter needed to have violence at its heart. And so when it became centered on the Birmingham church bombing, I couldn't just throw in the Hart-Celler Act. I couldn't just throw in Vatican II. So those were topics that I really wanted to be able to talk about, that because of the Turning Points format and not wanting to crowd the timeline at any point, those topics didn't get the due that I thought they would if I had written that chapter even 1 year earlier, or maybe if I had written it 15 years later, I would have felt differently. But those are really, really big topics, huge effects on lots of forms of American Christianity. The immigration, so many immigrants post 1965 Christians, and they're bringing forms of Christianity from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America. That didn't end up getting its due in the book, as Mark Knoll pointed out in the foreword. And to not talk about Vatican II is just kind of ridiculous, but I couldn't figure out where to put it, so I didn't.